There's one other bit of information. You remember we were the first to reveal on this program, the Promise program, the federal program. The acronym for it is Promise, that was put in place by the superintendent in Broward County. His guy's name is Runcie. They imported him from Chicago. Remember, he was the architect of the Promise program. Do you remember what the Promise program is? You do? Tell me. Just tell me what it is. I'll see if you pass the test. All right. Well, what it was, pretty close. They decided, the Obama administration decided that they didn't like the fact that the greatest percentage of prisoners behind bars was African American. They thought that meant the criminal justice system was biased against African Americans, and a bunch of innocent African Americans had been put in jail because the country's inherently racist. Now, they used that statistic, civil rights community and Reverend Jackson and his crowd used that statistic repeatedly to argue for the innocence of African Americans that had been charged with various crimes by suggesting a country with only, 10 to 11, 13% population African American, over half the prison population is African American. It's a racist country. And so the Promise program came along, and its purpose was that whenever felonies were committed, especially by minors or young adults, that were African American, they were to be ignored. And they were be charged to a much lesser crime so as to avoid placing these perps in prison. This was seen as a solution to the unfair, racist, and bigoted policies that had put so many African Americans in jail, and as they wanted us to believe, illegally and undeservedly. Well, when the case of this shooter in Parkland came up, his last name was Cruz, and remember in the aftermath we learned how many different times various people were warned. Law enforcement was warned. The number of times is in the 30s or 40s that this guy was something bad news. Do something before this guy does what he's going to do. There were even a couple of people who warned the cops and the sheriff that this guy may light up a school. It was all ignored because of the Promise program. Because if you're going to have to ignore felonies committed by African Americans, you're going to have to ignore felons committed by others as well. Otherwise, the program doesn't work, because if you start divvying up justice by race, it's going to get noticed eventually. So they had to go lax on every. It turns out that Mr. Runcie had said in response to numerous questions 5 or 6 times that this Cruz guy, the Promise program had nothing to do with him. This guy never interacted with the Promise program. We never exempted this guy. The news from over the weekend is that he was exempted from actions that he had taken by the invocation of the Promise program 5 different times. 5 different times the shooter at the high school was essentially let go because of the Promise program. Marco Rubio has since found out about this and is livid because everybody was lied to about it. Now, this would not have come up until much later in the program today, except I had this soundbite from NPR, which they need to translate what you and I believe. So I wanted to take the occasion here to be crystal clear that much of what you've been told about the aftermath, well, even before the shooting, the Promise program was a huge factor. This guy could have been taken off the streets because of previous crimes committed if it weren't for this Obama program called Promise. Another left-wing program designed to even out the injustices born of a racist America. So they artificially impose beliefs such as we have a racist criminal justice system and then create a law to deal with that artificiality. And it's typical when the left gets involved, rolls up its sleeves, and starts monkeying with basic sociology. They make a mess out of everything. They ruin everything they touch. It ends up being corrupted. It ends up being damaged one way or the other. Take a time out here. We'll come back and review the 3 different instances where judges from the bench have blown to smithereens the concept and the premise of the Mueller investigation. Back after this.